Hi folks, welcome to the Restoration Couple. In today's video I'm going to be showing you how I built this. And the question is, did I manage to do a deck in a day? Stick around and we'll see if I managed it. Right, a couple of things we need to mention before we get stuck into the fun stuff. If you're building a deck any higher than 300 millimeters off your ground level, then you're going to need planning permission here in the UK. You can't just go building a raised deck and peering over your neighbour's fence. Building regulations may also be involved. Believe it or not, this is actually a temporary structure. It's here just to make those steps safe. It's going to last the summer. After that, it may well all be taken down. Stick around to the end of the build and I will tell you a few of the details, a few of the things you need to watch out for, and also how much it costs to do. So to kick off the structure itself, I'm using some galvanized post bases. These are bolt down ones. I've got some existing concrete there, so that slab's fairly sound. I can bolt each one down and it gives a bit of adjustability as far as getting the posts nice and plumb. That said, where I had some dodgy concrete to work with, where there was a fall put into the concrete, I did grind or chip away at some of that to make sure that they were pretty close before we put the posts in. We're using posts that are going from the ground level up to handrail, which keeps things really simple. And then I'm using the old porch wall as our mid-span support. That means that I know what level I need to come across to, and I'm using some 150mm joists either side of those posts to create our front beam. When you're working on your own, clamps are your best mate, so clamps everywhere to get everything in position. I then used another length on the wall, pre-installed those hangers so they were ready. It's a bit easier to do it that way, and then that was just fixed onto the wall using some sleeve anchors. I needed to make sure there was a bit of a fall with the deck running with the grooves, so I could set that beam and that would be what I referenced everything else off, and then we could get it all bolted in place. Alright, get it nice and tight. Make sure you ratchet it, yeah? So you can go back the same way. You don't have to keep going round and round. You can go click, click, click. So with all the joists laid out now and into the hangers on the far wall, I can then now use that to make sure all of our posts are plumb. So I can just tweak it back and forth until I'm happy, and then use some screws just to tack it in place. And we ended up with something that's pretty flat and decent, ready to lay our decking. So that was the end of our 4 or 5 hours on the first day. So to make up our deck in a day, we needed to finish the rest in another half of a day. So I ran all of our timbers long, and for that reason I can then just snap a chalk line and cut them off afterwards. As far as efficiency goes, I tend to find it works a bit quicker and a bit easier that way. I could then use those offcuts as our noggins on the centre span. With the structure finished, I could get all the boards up and dry lay them out. That makes everything a little bit safer and means that we can start visualising how it's going to lay out and also mark up ready for our screws. The first board is notched around those posts, as is the second one that's notched back in. That way we can make sure that our posts just run straight the way up through. If you were going to use newel posts, then you could do them separately and bolt them to the structure and cut the fence posts off below. I'll talk about that a bit more at the end. And then Eden and I, with a chalk line, just snapped a line on every single joist, which will show exactly where we needed to run our screws. Just keeps things neat and tidy, and there's no guesswork involved. Now, with the girls still keen to help, it made sense to give them a job. Now, this doesn't really save a huge amount of time, maybe 10-20%, but they can go along with those screws and tap them onto that line in the right groove, and they are ready for me to just drive down. Now I talk about the spacing and the gaps and the importance of that at the end of the video, but it meant that I could go along with that little packer or that shim in between each and make sure we had even spacings on all of the boards. These stainless screws aren't the cheapest, but actually they're nice and neat, they go in well, and hopefully if we do need to take this deck down sometime soon, then we'll be able to find them and pull them out and I can use them again. As with the joists, I ran all the deck boards long and then I could cut them off afterwards. You can do a circular saw for this, but the track saw is even better because I can just line it up just above the end joist and I can leave the first and the last deck board there to support the track. Then just finish them off by hand. And this is the point where we admit defeat. Deck in a day didn't quite happen. 2 afternoons and we got to this point, so basically we had all the boards down, we had the structure done, and I guess you could argue, or I at least argued myself, that we had a deck done. If this was on a lower level and you weren't doing handrails or stairs, then pretty much done a deck. We need to do stairs and we need to do a handrail, so day 2. So day 2 kicked off by doing the stair stringers. I needed to make 3 for the width of our steps, and it's a fairly straightforward process. You can plug into an online website calculator your dimensions and get your measurements that way, or you can go old school and work it all out. I did a bit of a hybrid between the two and used that framing square to make sure all of our runs and rises and treads and everything were exactly how we needed them. Once you've got one, then you use that as your template for the next ones. These are all cut from 9-inch joists or 225mm joists, and that's just about borderline. The throat on them is about the minimum you can have. That said, my spacings are very close together, so we just about got away with it using that timber. And then as a bit of a trick, I think it was Samurai Carpenter I saw this on years ago, where you can stick some coach bolts in the bottom to account for uneven ground, and then you know you're fully supported at the bottom. I had to nip out and grab this one last post, which would just be for the last bit of the handrails to terminate against. Now I talk about handrail height at the end of the video, but I wanted to make sure that everything was cut level. So all of these posts are run long, i.e. they're higher than needed. What I wanted to do is install my handrails and then cut them flush with the top of that. That made sure that everything is nice and flat and level around, and we're not using the deck as a reference because of course we have to put a fall into the deck to make sure it sheds the rainwater. Now we're on to some more fruit-based timber. This length, 4.8 lengths of 2x2 or 45mm square is pretty undesirable as far as straightness goes, but by the time you cut them down they're pretty straight in their sections. They're going to be our spindles. Yes, I could spend, it's about half the price of buying proper deck spindles. They're a bit chunkier and they're less refined, but actually they're going to do the job and they look just fine. With this style of decking, some people put these spindles on the outside so it looks better from the deck side. I prefer to look back up at the house and have it neat that side. Now the very last part of the build was to finish off the handrail to cap it off. So I went to my other local sawmill, which is Charlton's, and their deck boards, their heavy duty stuff, has a flat surface, it's smooth on one side, which means it's ideal for using for this, where I'm capping off the top. It doesn't have the relief cuts like the other decking I used. So just to make more work for myself, I mitered the corners, and then I used pocket holes in this instance to get it all pre-constructed as a U shape. Nice and tight joins, where as best I could at least, and then I could fit that as one and fit it then down onto the handrail or the top rail of our spindles. A few final touches included cutting back some of the overhangs, and then I could install another length of decking at the front, again with a smooth face facing out. You could go all the way around with that, but it would probably be a bit excessive for this temporary deck. And the other benefit of those smooth faced decking is I can use them as the risers just to close it off, again just to give it a tidier look. It turns out I'm not very good at short-term bodge jobs, and I've built something that's probably a bit over-engineered and over the top. That said, I've built it in a way that the whole lot will come down. When we come to do this extension or build off the back here, then I can take all this down. Most of the timber that I've bought for this is all standard structural timber that I can use actually in that building or on other projects. One small thing I did afterwards, which I also did on the playhouse deck, is I installed some plastic underneath with a nice fall away from the house, and that just means any of the water, the rainwater that gets through the gaps between the deck boards, we've got dry storage under here. It falls on and then it just sheds off the end. So this is the same thing I've done with the playhouse deck, and it worked really well over there. For the last 2 years, that's where I keep cement and lime and everything, and it always stays bone dry. And as for the stairs, the stringers that we've cut, and indeed the joists and all the timbers, if you were doing this in a very permanent way, then some people go and put a tape or even just some DPC over all that, so that when the rain comes down, there's nothing, that where you have issues is normally where wood and wood meet, and it traps the moisture in there. It's less likely to dry out. So what quite often happens on a deck is it fails at that point. So if you have a tape or even just strips of DPC there, then some would argue that that's a better way of protecting the joists in the substructure underneath. Of course, we didn't do that because the likelihood is this is coming out before the end of the year, but it gave us a chance to have a little crack at building some steps. Pretty simple, bit of head scratching and a bit of maths involved, but once you've made one of the stringers, you use that as a template for the other two. All I've got to do is stick a handrail on here and it's job done. Well, there we go. I think it worked out pretty well, and actually it's turned out to be a really well-loved used space. When you've got a little one crawling around, having a 1 meter drop down to the garden is not fun. It's not a nice, calm environment to be in when it's summertime. The porch is gone. There's no longer a danger there. Everything is almost at kitchen level, so we can leave that door open, stairgate shut, and we can sit down and have a cup of tea without wondering where everyone is. As promised, here are some of the details that I probably skimmed over during the video. This is just standard 2x2 or 45mm square treated timber. It's the same dimension or same thickness as your other joists and things like that. They're thicker, they're a bit chunky looking, but they're absolutely fine. As far as the newel posts go, now most decks tend to use a more decorative newel post, in which case these are actually, the structural posts are cut off below the deck level. You then bolt your newel posts to your structure, and that's what's above. These are super solid because actually they run all the way down to that bracket on the concrete. Everything's locked in. They're just square fence posts, but they're the ones that haven't been incised, so they're not as ugly to look at. And of course, all of this could be sanded and stained and it would look great. Right, quick bit on regulations. I'm no expert here, but as far as decks go, once you're over a certain height, which is I think 600 millimeters, then you need to raise the height of your handrail. In this case, it's 1100 millimeters for the main deck area and 900 millimeters on the stairs and landing. The spindles, you just need to make sure that this gap, as you would in the house, that can't be less than 100. So if you use a piece of 95 mil stud work or joist or whatever, that is a nice little block that you can use all the way around. That needs to be the same everywhere. So make sure that if you've got a fall on the deck, then you're starting to lay things horizontal and level, you want to make sure you're picking the highest point to reduce that. In our case, this base rail down here, our deck falls towards me. I made sure that that followed the deck, so there wasn't that sort of graduated gap underneath. As far as the deck boards go, I went for the heavier, juicy, commercial grade stuff. It's not a crazy amount more, and it's just the brittle, cheap budget stuff I've used before in the playhouse. It doesn't stay as flat, and this stuff is just nice and solid, gives it a strong feel underfoot. We're about 3 weeks later now. These gaps, working off that 3mm basis that I used, I've watched them open and close a little bit, with wet weather and then a really hot day, but this is about right. I can't imagine they're going to open up to a really crazy amount, even after a couple of years. So 3mm seems to be the sweet spot, but interested to hear what other people do. One thing we haven't talked about is cost. Now, I picked up 95% of everything in that one load in the van. It came in at £470 or so. So it's a fairly sizable chunk, and then I picked up the smooth face deck boards the day after just for this top and the front trim. So in all, it's probably just over £500, but then don't forget all that hardware. Stainless steel screws, they do add up, a few hangers, bolts, and I think that was it. So, £550, £600. No, it's not a tiny deck, it's about just over 4 meters by just under 3 meters. So it's a decent size. For what we needed, and again, I will emphasize it, it's temporary, it's not a long-term solution. Anyway, there we go. Lots of things I would do in a different way if this was something that's going to be up for decades. In the size of fixings, maybe chunkier joists, maybe look at that tape or a DPC or something to protect wood in certain places, and something a bit more decorative for the spindles. But in essence, the main building science of it, or the building construction methods of it, don't really change. So there we go, that is my quick deck build. We didn't quite manage it in a day, but 2 days isn't bad for something like this. Thank you for watching. Any questions down below, and remember, if you can, do it yourself. We'll see you next time.